So, a bunch of years back, I went with a couple of friends in New York City to see a piece of so called political theater that was an evening with Karl Marx. And it was apparently a show that this guy, like, I think doing the show, like, it was his thing. It was what he did. And I was definitely going. I think all of us were kind of going for a goof. It was a situation where either it was free or I think there was a friend of a friend involved. I don't really remember. And it was literally, one man show where this guy was, had written a one man show where he played Karl Marx and he talked to the audience. And it was complete with an introduction and a post conversation with Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! And I remember going and thinking, I didn't have very high hopes for the evening, and I think on the way there, a thought that occurred to me that I said to my friend afterward. I said, "Do you know what they call good political theater?" And my answer was theater, right? And my thought was that if you put political in front of something, you're essentially pre-excusing it being bad as art. That's not entirely fair, I know. However, uh, there's a lot of great theater out there, going all the way back to Shakespeare, that has had real insights about politics and how societies and nations and power work, where it's not really necessary to preface it with that. And I know at the time I didn't have any particular bias against its subject matter. I mean, since then, I've come to think of Karl Marx as a figure that I'm just utterly baffled that is still talked about as if his ideas are still particularly relevant today. In other words, he's obviously important as a historical figure and is well worth understanding his ideas so we can understand things that happened in the past. But I do think that the worldview of looking at everything through the lens of the oppressor and the oppressed, and the only redemption being through revolution, as being a pretty corrosive, sour way of looking at the world. Uh, and I suppose that leads into this bigger question of politics and art that I've been thinking about, which is, does it belong there? How does it belong there? What does it all mean? And I think where I've landed on this subject is that most of the time, when really great art is political, it's still not really, or rather, it doesn't show up as political on its first pass necessarily. In other words, it's reaching past the current moment and trying to discover something universal, trying to discover something about people, trying to synthesize something that you see out there in the world that you also see in yourself, going all the way up to the point where you're finding the thing that's unresolved or the thing that's uncertain, and you are asking a question about it or posing a hypothesis about it. And of course, there are all sorts of examples of an idea being of its moment, like some of Bob Dylan's songs that were, a blowing in the wind, or the times they are a changin', that were universal in their scope, and which he was sort of famously unwilling to comment on the exact meanings of things, but were so appropriate for that moment that they were, adopted to mean very specific things to very specific people, and understandably so. But yet they also have this quality of timelessness that some of the other stuff from that period doesn't have. And it's because it doesn't have that axe to grind that often comes with trying to put an overtly political message into things. Now, I'm of course talking about a really big subject here that I think, the chances approach 100% that I'm gonna get something wrong or miss some piece of this, and also probably that I'm going to violate, my own ideas or own rules in work that I do in the future. So I'm just reaching into that same place and seeing what comes out. I think the thing that's really tricky about art and politics in this moment is that a lot of people are having the experience that we're having this incredibly political moment just in our culture and in the world, where everything is being seen through this lens of, is it progressive or is it regressive? Is it left or is it right? Is it populist or is it globalist? Is it nationalist? Is it this or is it that? And it all feels really up for consideration. And I think this is partly the nature of the moment. I mean, if you ask me, it's partly because all of these systems are of looking at the world, they're all built on a foundation of lies. And they're all built all of these ways of looking at the world are connected to narratives that are ultimately designed to prevent you from really thinking for yourself, from really being creative, and for really contributing what's needed. That everything is, there's these deep grooves that no matter where you go, they're just something's ready to just push you and you fall into the groove, and then everybody goes, oh, you're that guy, and therefore I either care about what you say or I don't have to listen to it. And I think one of the really important things to consider is how much through history culture and art has been created by people who are at the margins, people who are not respectable, right? People who are saying things that are offensive to a particular powerful group or to a particular culturally dominant group. And it's very important to understand that when we look back in history, we're always looking with the benefit of how our perspective has changed. So that things that were really, really, really culturally edgy and ideas that were really, really new have such broad acceptance now, we sort of look back at history and we imagine ourselves as being these people who are cool enough to get it, right? And that's of course this same fantasy, right? We all want to believe that if we were at, the Newport Folk Festival when Bob Dylan came out with an electric guitar, we would have been like, yeah, that's pretty cool, right? But just like many things in history, that's generally speaking not the case. In other words, when I say that the innovators and that the great artists are often doing things that are offensive, I'm talking about you. I'm talking about me. I'm talking about things that are offensive or don't seem respectable or seem ill-considered or half-baked or poorly thought out or dangerous now. And that's really important. And it's important to consider partly because there is a trend in to sort of weaponize culture for political ends to make sure people only say certain things. I think that it is very important that that's being looked at and talked about, but I think it's a movement that's failing and is destined to fail and is headed straight for the ash bin of history because so much of it is so preposterous. So where am I going with this? Well, I think where I'm going with it is that so much of the time when we're thinking about injecting a political message into something creative, if we can identify it as political, that probably means that it's kind of already overripe and past its prime. Now, there are definitely exceptions to this. I mean, Rage Against the Machine is a band that, if all of their songs were about birthday cake, they would still totally kick ass, right? I mean, you don't have to be on board with their political worldview to recognize it as being something that is powerful and compelling. But there it is. I mean, it is part of it, and it's very, very specific. So obviously, there are exceptions to this, or maybe they're not exceptions. Maybe there's something to this that I haven't figured out or thought about yet. But that really, if we're trying to make art that's going to affect the world culturally and politically, that's really going to make a contribution, going to put that thing that's uniquely us out into the world, well, then it's going to be very important not to be too locked in to any particular ideology, and not to be too afraid about being put in a box because you explored some idea or said some thing or another. And that really, and this touches a little bit on what I was talking about yesterday with the Big Lebowski, that you have to have that humility to know that you may not even know exactly what the message is that's trying to come out, right? That you have to have that openness and that willingness to explore in order to find it. And the way someone else understands it may be different than what your intention is, and the way that you understand it after you did it may be completely different than what you did going into it. So this is why I'm exploring this idea, and this is why I think that I may have found that there's an inherent contradiction between political thought and creative thought, which is that politics is inherently a low-resolution view of the world, and a view of the world that tends to neatly categorize things and to take us away from the inner exploration. And even if you're exploring an idea about the outside world that may overlap with politics, it's always going to be that piece of internal exploration, that piece of discovering that worst quality of your enemy is something you understand in yourself, right? And writing the joke about it, or putting that understanding into the lyric or into the screenplay or whatever, that's what's going to give it that vitality, that's going to take it out of that realm of preaching to people and take it into the realm of something universal and something that everyone can discover something in. And this is important right now because whether we say it out loud or not, right, everyone understands that we're on the verge of moving into one of the greatest things that's ever happened. That there's a golden age available on this planet, in this world. And the other alternative is that it all completely goes to hell and it's all over. So if you have something to contribute that really is universal, that's really going to contribute to that understanding that's going to be necessary for us to have things turn out in a positive way, well, then it's needed. And I guess that's why I'm talking to you today. All right. So we did it. Thanks for listening, and talk to you again soon.